Hi everyone, thank you for joining today, and it's actually a pleasure to have all of you here at the Conclave. My name is Venkatesh. As I said before, I'm the founder and president of the Swatantrata. So Swatantrata is a policy and grassroots advocacy organization where we focusing on advancing choice and opportunity for the people, especially the ones who's actually on the marginalized. And so our idea is what kind of ideas, policies that can actually enables the people to build a decent life with dignity. And some of the ideas we actually believe in, economic activity is one of the foundational ideas we believe in, and people should have fundamental freedom to lead their life with certain rights and also responsibilities. And also we believe in to embrace the greater economic activity and productivity. We believe in open market system that is actually protected by the rule of law, and the state that actually restricted by the constitution. And so since last 6 months, we've been actually exploring these ideas and also more ideas. So some of the ways what we do is through digital activism and also through grassroots advocacy. So we want to bring some of these ideas to the people, to the masses, where they can understand what kind of ideas that really actually make an impact, which sometimes people not able to see it directly. So we wanted to actually elaborate it and see it in a more fundamental way and explain them how these kind of ideas can actually impact their lives, to build the greater life, to advance the human flourishment. So as a part of it, we actually do various kind of activities. Youth Parliament is one of our flagship program where we actually bring together various ideological groups that believes in a different kind of ideas and bring trying to change the political system, how politics works, what kind of ideas actually improve the outcomes of the politics, as many people see as a politics as a big problem, and we wanted to address along with some other ideas. So Youth Parliament program is one of our flagship, and we actually had a leadership bootcamp where we're focusing on policy and also leadership and also technology, sustainable development goals, how youth can actually contribute it. And we also have a policy conclave with some of the speakers like Sriram Curry, who's actually a well-known journalist, Nalamo Chakravarti, who's actually a grassroots advocate and also an entrepreneur. So as we are all actually stuck in this pandemic, we were actually thought how we can actually bring these ideas during this time. So this e-policy conclave is the one of the idea we come up with. We wanted to actually bring leading scholars, leading experts, and actually bring their ideas on how they actually seeing it from their perspective, and what kind of ideas what kind of ideas that are actually working, what are not working. So through this, we wanted to explore what kind of policies that can actually consider as the best practices this time, what kind of ideas and government decisions actually working well for the people, what kind of ideas are not working, how we can actually improve the conditions right now. So today we have one of a good friend and also strong supporter of our work from CCS, Bhuvana, and she actually works as a director of research at Center for Civil Society, which is actually leading market liberal think tank. And also she also worked with various organizations like UK High Commission and also other organizations that deals with public distribution system. She especially worked certain areas where poor can actually benefit through various policies, and our focus was very, very interesting. We would like to hear from her how what kind of work Center for Civil Society do, because it's one of the leading think tank in India, and what is a public policy, what kind of impact public policy creates, and is public policy is really matters, before she go into best policy practices during the era of the pandemic. Here you go, Bhuvana.
Thank you, Venkatesh. It's a pleasure to be here. I've watched Venkatesh grow from an alum of CCS, I think, into starting this incredible organization, which I'm very excited about. Thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure and honor. Venkatesh, you've thrown a lot of questions at me for 30 minutes. I'm going to try and do as much justice as I can. I'm actually going to spend less time speaking so that we can have more interaction. Okay, unmuted. So that we can have more questions and interaction. For the question answer session, I'm wondering what the best way to do it. Venkatesh, will you be moderating, or how should we do that?
They can actually write on the chart, and I will actually ask it.
Yes, please. That would be great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so a little bit about me and, well, mostly about the organization I represent. I've been associated with Center for Civil Society for on and off for about 2 decades now. I like to say that I'm the prime example of catch them young and watch them grow. I came to CCS as an intern. In fact, I was one of CCS's first interns. And many decades later, well, 2 decades later, I run research and policy engagement at Center for Civil Society. CCS has worked in several different areas over the last 2 decades. Our fundamental belief is that there are multiple ways to bring about social change. And one big way to bring about social change is through the instrument of public policy, meaning the entire universe of laws, regulations, rules, public investments, interventions, schemes, etc., right? Using the offices of government towards certain outcomes. And there is a distinct advantage to using public policy as the instrument of change, as the instrument of social change, which is that more than any other form of action, policy action is larger. It affects more people at one go. It has a certain stick-to-itiveness, meaning that it is relevant across time or for a long span of time, and you're able to correct it again in one stroke, and there is a feedback loop that comes in. So a lot of the times when we are activists, what we call direct action, it tends to have more limited scope. There's no, I would never argue that it is substitutable, but it is important to understand what it serves and what it doesn't. Policy action, on the other hand, has many of these scale advantages. Why is policy relevant, right? Why should we care about policy? And particularly, Venkatesh, as you were pointing out, that something in politics is broken, and can politics really affect outcomes? Does it matter that much? Those kinds of questions are often in our mind, particularly among those who live in cities. We find that people don't go to elections as much, right? They don't cast their vote. So what's going on there? And my sense is that I want to tell you a story based sort of an example that we've used in the past at CCS. How many of you remember the 90s and the filmmaking industry in the 90s? It was particularly true in Bollywood, but also I'm sure in, in the Hyderabad film industry, in the Chennai film industry, in Bangalore. Are you guys familiar with what the world looked like then? Anybody? Priya Lakshmi?
Yes, ma'am.
What was the world like?
In the film industry?
90s, yeah, in the 90s in the film industry.
I think I remember seeing movies like Bharat Bandh and movies by Narayan Rao and all. So it was more about activism, actually.
Sure, the film content was very activist, of course, but something else was going on. I don't know if you remember the news headlines all through the 90s. You know, it was about Dawood Ibrahim and it was about Chota Rajan. And there was a lot of this Bollywood, particularly in Bollywood. I'm from Bombay, so I'm a little bit more familiar with the Hindi film industry. But I think this was common across film industries in India, which is that the underworld had a huge relationship going on with filmmakers. They were financing films, they were threatening filmmakers, there was extortion, there was murder. It was all a little dark
Yes.
and gloomy. Do you guys remember this?
Yes, I do. I
Yeah.
do.
So, what was going on? Why were filmmakers that excited? Why was the underworld so interested and so enmeshed in the filmmaking industry? Anybody want to venture a guess? No? Okay, here's an interesting fact. Until 2000, 2001, filmmaking was not a legitimate industry or business. And this is per policy. So, meaning that the RBI did not allow banks to lend to filmmakers. Um, uh, the Companies Act did not recognize filmmaking. So, you couldn't start a legitimate production house as a registered company. So, largely what was happening was that the financing for filmmaking came from those who had large stacks of cash and were able to pull that kind of cash. Who had that kind of money and that kind of strong arm? It was the underworld, it was the mafia. And in 2001, the first break came when RBI released these new regulations and notifications saying that from today, banks can lend money as well as you can raise money on the equity and debt market for filmmaking. Overnight, almost in the next 3 to 4 years, you saw the entire landscape of filmmaking change. You had large companies stepping in, existing corporate houses now started production companies. Existing production companies went legitimate. Some even got listed on the stock exchange. You had banks stepping up and saying, we're also a financier for films. And slowly, you found that all of this business of, encounter killings and wiping out the mafia and all of that kind of stuff overnight almost died. The mafia and filmmaking became completely irrelevant. So this is sort of the power of public policy, right? So in one way, such a small little action can have huge ramifications in ways that we didn't even think imaginable. And sort of this is why CCS has advocated so strongly for the story of social change through public policy. And over the last many years, I've had the chance to immerse myself in this world. And I find it to be as true as the day I started, that there is no better instrument or stronger instrument in a modern Republican system than there is of public policy to be able to change both behavior as well as outcomes for all, particularly the poorest. So with this sort of backdrop in mind, I want to start talking a little bit about the situation that we find ourselves in today, right? All of us are holed up at home. There is an enforced lockdown. There is no end in sight. Technically, tomorrow they were supposed to lift the lockdown, but that doesn't seem to be happening. The country has been sort of set up into zones, and nobody quite knows how we get out of this. Nobody quite knows until a vaccine or a medicine appears what happens. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. People's livelihoods are affected. Millions of people are stranded away from homes, stranded without livelihoods. Companies have stopped manufacturing. The economy has sort of come to a standstill. So a lot of things are going on. I'm sure most of you are familiar with all of this. So the brief that was given to me by the Swatantrata team was, let's talk about best practices in public policy. Let's talk about how did we find ourselves here and where do we go from here. So I want to submit 3 big arguments and then invite reactions from all of you. The first argument is, in India, one part of why we find ourselves in such a terrible jam, more than other places, is twofold. A, that we are way too poor, right? Poverty is an ill, it is evil, and we have not dealt with poverty swiftly enough. So that's argument 1. Second is that we have built a large state, a huge state machinery. The state machinery does everything. It runs restaurants and guest houses. It runs hospitals and primary health centers. It runs public sector enterprises, which used to until recently make leather goods. It runs airlines. It runs defense. It tries to do policing. It does everything that you can imagine. This large state, however, is missing a philosophy. It is missing a set of clean objectives on what the state should do. What is the primary purpose of the state? In particular, in relationship to the situation we find ourselves in, it has sort of exhibited very poor understanding that the role of the state is in public goods and in sort of managing externalities or preventing and encouraging positive externalities, limiting negative externalities, and third, in creating an environment where the private sector thrives. So this is argument number 2, that we have much too large a state, but this large state doesn't seem to have an operating philosophy. And the third argument I want to make is that in health in particular, the Indian state has invested in too many of the wrong things and too little on the right things. What are the wrong things? The wrong things are, 1, direct provision, so health care as opposed to public health. It has spent way too much time and energy controlling the activities of private players, far too less in setting up accountability systems around its own provisioning. And 3, where it should be regulating, it has not regulated. Where it need not regulate, it has regulated. Where it has regulated, it has regulated very poorly. So these are the 3 big arguments that I want to make, and I want to give you some examples around this. The first argument was around poverty and why poverty is hitting us doubly bad. A huge challenge that appeared with the pandemic was the swiftness with which it came and the harshness with which it came, because there was no end in sight and there's no cure available. What does this mean? This meant that overnight we closed down borders, we refused to allow people to travel, but the poorest of the poor, be it street vendors, be it farmers, be it migrant workers and day laborers, they were stuck without any alternative income sources. They had to pay rents, they had their families far away from them, and their lives were made miserable overnight. Now imagine, contrast to that, I imagine most of us who are middle class, perhaps even upper middle class, the pandemic has affected us, but it's an inconvenience. It is not life or death yet, right? We have managed to find ways to opt out. Just think about this. We are having this great conversation here using everything that modern technology has made available to us. Whereas there is a large segment of this country that is wondering where their next meal comes from. This is anathema. It should hurt in our stomach that we have allowed this to happen 70 years after the founding of the Republic. We have no excuse. And think about how much investment we have made in poverty alleviation, but never in thinking about what is the path to prosperity for our millions. So this is one example of why I argue that the pandemic has hit us far worse and will continue to, because we are still very poor. The second argument is about the role of the state, how large and how small our state is. Simple things, right? I was telling you about all the various things that the state does and all the things that it doesn't do. A couple of our colleagues at George Mason at the Mercatus Center released this great paper on state capacity in healthcare. Healthcare in India just after the pandemic hit. And they find that compared to the rest of the world, on the number of doctors that are available in India, on the number of healthcare service providers in general, on the number of hospital beds, on the number of ventilators, emergency equipment, and on the stockpile of medicines, we are failing deeply. What led us to this? Surely the state that can run restaurants should have been able to figure out how to run healthcare systems, or at least how to manage money spent on healthcare, right? So every time we have a question of what do we spend our money on, instead of thinking from first principles, we end up thinking, oh, here is a pile of money. Let's apportion it across every single flight of fancy that occurs to us. So be it controlling BD workers, or to be it, running leather factories, be it putting money behind loss-making airlines. We are happy to do all of it, but not the big purposes that are non-negotiable, right? So the size of our state has both made it very difficult for it to be agile, but at the same time, it has also sort of done too many things it should not, too few things of the things that it should have. The third argument is particularly concerning what we have done in the realm of health. Two things have happened. One is that we've doubled down on investments in healthcare, meaning primary health centers, district health centers, hospitals, large hospitals, clinics, etc. But where it comes to the private sector, we have sort of tied their hands in a number of different ways, whether it is by having very poor quality environmental regulations, whether it is, when I say poor quality, I don't mean too few. I mean the ones that don't get you the outcomes, but increase the compliance burden on the private sector tremendously. For example, the ways in which the state pollution control committees end up regulating hospitals, right? Or for that matter, how labs are regulated. Hello, little one, whose ever baby that was. Or whether it was in terms of how labs are set up in India, or whether it is in terms of how we produce drugs. We're fighting the rest of the world with the generic drug regime and what happens here. There are several, or the biggest issue that I have in all of this is how we regulate healthcare personnel. We have created guilds of doctors with the Medical Commission of India. We have created guilds in the nursing profession by not allowing free entry and exit, by putting too many entry barrier requirements in terms of qualifications, in terms of certifications, in terms of mobility, and therefore restricted the number of personnel that are coming up. So in several different ways, we have tied the hands of what should naturally have emerged in as service delivery to the people. We've continued to spend very large amounts of money for very poor outcomes. The CAG audits a few years ago had these very interesting observations where they said that for most of the things in public health centers or in government provided health services are either very poor quality, they are not customer responsive, they're spending their expenditure per unit is very high, both in terms of patients as well as in terms of size of facility. All of these kinds of issues keep us behind and keep us from dealing with the substantive questions. So this is the sort of environment in which the pandemic has hit us. So I often, sort of try to press home that yes, it is true that this is unique. Yes, it is true that this has happened to the world perhaps for the first time since 1918, that we've also, we assumed that things like pandemics were a thing of the past, and now it would be a very different kind of biological hit if we ever took one. But because we have such poor setup right at the start, we are then, when we are faced with an emergency, things don't line up the way they should, right? So it's worse for us. It takes us far longer to get our act together. It takes us far longer to negotiate with the world. It takes us far longer to recover. So that's the sort of setup in which COVID-19 has hit us. What happened when COVID-19 hit us? A few things. One, we were obviously taken by surprise when we should not have been. That's lesson one, right? Where was our public health monitoring system? The world was already crying hoarse. Several people for 2 months preceding had raised the heckles, saying that, look, China is our neighbor, it's spreading everywhere. Italy by that point had been in lockdown for about 3 weeks. We were still not screening people at airports. We had still not figured out what our strategy was going to be should this pandemic come home. So that was the start of our response. We were caught like a deer in headlights. I don't blame the government. I just think that you need, now that we know what should we be doing next time. One, we need to have our monitoring systems up. We need to have our red, green, orange alert systems up. So we know something is coming and so that we can start preparing for action. The second is what we did with the science of it all, right? When you're dealing with public health, you need to have a very strong setup that rewards good science and punishes bad science. This setup is near absent in India. What do I mean by good science and bad science? Simple things, right? When they said you need to start testing people, the first thing that we did is to say that only government labs will test. This was step one. Step two, we said that ICMR, which is merely an accrediting body, will now overnight become the regulator for all testing in India. There is already, mind you, a Clinical Establishments Act that exists that is not implemented in most places in this country. I think about 11 out of 28 states have actually implemented the Clinical Establishments Act. So overnight, you set up, you gave extraordinary regulatory powers to an agency that had never regulated before, that only accredited. The third thing that you did, you realized that, listen, government labs, we have about 100, 120 labs. We surely can't test everybody in this country, or even can't test based on the limited protocols that we have set up. What the hell are we going to do? So overnight we said, okay, we'll invite selectively some private players. And we started to create a approval system, which was controlled by ICMR. Now here is where the bad science comes in. We turned around and we said, actually, if you have to get approval, you have to show 100% sensitivity and specificity of the tests. What do I mean by sensitivity and specificity? These are scientific terms. It means that every test has to be 100% right when it says positive result, meaning that you are positive for COVID. It has to be 100% right when it says you are negative for COVID. Worldwide, not a single regulator insists on 100% accuracy. This is science. This is the human body. It is, there are 100 different complexities that go in. You want to look for averages. You want to look for a distribution. You want to look for most coverage, not necessarily 100% coverage. So we went ahead and insisted on bad science as the principle. The fourth thing that we ended up doing is then saying that, okay, we're allowing private sector to run these tests, but you have to offer these tests within this price ceiling. So we said, if you are doing an antibody test, you couldn't charge more than 1,500. If you were doing what is called an RT-PCR test, or the RNA test, it couldn't be more than 3,000. If you were offering either of these tests at home, you could charge no more than an additional 1,500. So that was the 4,500 rupee mark that they came up with. So you put a price ceiling. That was the fourth thing you ended up with. The fifth thing that happened was the Supreme Court jumped in and said, no, you must offer free tests. The private sector must offer free tests for everybody. Then the government said, oh gosh, if you say this, the private sector will offer tests to nobody. So then the Supreme Court rolled back and said, well, maybe just to poor people. Then the government said, actually, we will issue the guidelines for what this means, right? Because even the government understood that this is a fool's errand. Okay, so this is a fourth thing that we did. The fifth thing that we did is the draconian lockdown, right? In some way, I can understand why we've had a lockdown. It makes sense. Indians were not following and not understanding the magnitude of what was happening. We were not quite getting the concept of externalities that was true of an infectious disease. We were not understanding what social distancing meant, and we were certainly not practicing it. So the government had to do something about it. It makes sense to me that they should lock it down. The problem is that when you do a lockdown, you can't continue it forever, right? You can't close a country of 1.3 billion people forever. You can't even close it down for 2 months. It's ridiculous to try and aim to do that. Now, we did this without giving anybody advance notice, without allowing anybody to prepare. And once you put the lockdown in place, it was not clear what you were doing in that time that you had earned. So lockdown should have given you some time to prepare, to think about what you would do next, how you would get out of the lockdown, and how you would manage the pandemic for the rest of the year or until a vaccine or treatment came up. So it was not clear what the status was, what the plan was. Last thing you did was you took too long to decentralize. Really, at this time, the most effective way of coping with systems like this is to have many different solutions that are tailored to a local context. And oftentimes, because when you make the policy feedback loop shorter, make it closer between the people and the decision makers, you are likely to get better outcomes. On this, we failed. So we started off with central whip, and then as we went, realized that, oh God, decentralization is probably our most powerful tool available. So these are the sort of overall things that I want to submit for your consideration. I see that it's about 6:40. I promised you that I wouldn't talk for too long. Let me stop myself here and take some questions. And maybe at the end, if we have time, I can make a few points more. Venkatesh, does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Yes?
Yes.
All right, let's look at some questions.
Here we have first question from Anas.
Sure.
You talked about the government role in healthcare. Should it be give a nudge to healthcare sector or to be fledged provider of the healthcare, or where do we draw a line between public health and private health?
Great question, Anas. So in economics, we have the concept of public goods, right? And one big argument is that the role of the government is to provide public goods. That being said, in economics is a very clear and precise definition of what is a public good. So a public good is that which is non-excludable and that which is non-rival, meaning that if your consumption of this public good does not leave less of it for somebody else, and my consumption of it does not preclude you from using it. So non-rival and non-excludable. These are the two benchmarks for what a public good is. Health, education, things like that in India, we often say these are public goods. This is not true. They are private goods, meaning that if I consume medicine, you cannot consume that medicine. If I take up a hospital bed, you cannot take up that hospital bed at the same time. However, the role then is, what is the infrastructure? The biggest role of the government that I can see is in financing. Government takes taxpayer money. Now, how about finding a way to get that money back into people's hands? So that's one clear role for the government. The second is to think about the overall, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. What is the externalities that come about? So for example, when you have TB or when you have the pandemic like coronavirus, it means that when I get it, my risk of infecting another 15 people who had nothing to do with it is very high. And in that turn, the kind of infrastructure and the costs that occur to both society as well as the economy are very high. So there is an argument to be made that the government has a role to play when there are externalities. So these are the two big roles for the government as far as the health sector is. However, does this mean that the government necessarily needs to run hospitals and healthcare services? That answer is not 100% clear to me, for two reasons. One is that we know the government does these things really, really badly, right? So we know this in people, there are a number of great studies. So for example, Jishnu Das and Karthik Muralidharan studied healthcare providers and healthcare practitioner behaviors in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. And they found some very interesting things. That in government hospitals, the time that a doctor gives, or the time that a doctor is present in the hospital is half that he's present in the private sector. Second is when he does see a patient, he gives that much less time to a patient. That same doctor runs a private clinic outside the government hospital. There he gives double the time, right? So we already know this, at least in the market world, we understand this as incentives at play. And the incentives in the government system are naturally broken. So what should the government be doing? The government should be thinking about, how do I get funding to science? How do I get funding to R&D? How do I do monitoring? How do I do what is called vector monitoring, etc., right? How a disease is spreading, what is happening with it, where is the locus of it, how do I contain, how do I think about a testing strategy? If it comes down to needing to test 1.3 billion people, how am I going to get that happening? How am I going to purchase services so that I can make them available for free to the poorest? How do I purchase these services from the private sector? These are sort of the bigger roles that you want government to be doing. Anas, I hope I answered your question. There are some more, which
Yes.
is...
The next question is from Arpit. He was asking, PM Care Fund has been
Yes.
kept out of the scrutiny of the CAG, and what was the need for a separate fund when we have a PMNRF, and how we can actually ensure fiscal accountability of the state?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think there was a need. Saugandhi, I think we've been...
Just a second. Ravi?
I think somebody's sharing their screen.
Yeah.
Anyway, I agree with you completely, Arpit. I do not think that there was a need for the PM Cares Fund. In particular, because when you set up government relief systems, you cannibalize local aid and relief, right? So every penny that went to the PM Cares Fund was a penny that did not go to the RSS to be able to give food delivery in local areas, or to Christian missionaries, or to madrasas, or to Sikh gurdwaras, or to NGOs like Praja in Bombay. So every single penny that you wanted to give for immediate aid and relief, you have now cannibalized from private philanthropy. This is a bad idea in principle, and in execution, it is a disastrous idea. You are exactly right, because it is set up as, I think, a society, if I'm not mistaken, and therefore it is out of the scrutiny of the CAG. And this is just poor fiscal accountability. This is poor accountability, period. What is the need? There is no need. I don't see the need, at least. And I would have argued that the PM should have taken a stand instead and said, listen, if your interest is immediate aid and relief, give to your local NGO. Give to your local service provider. Don't give it 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 miles from your hometown where you're making the donation. And how will you ensure fiscal accountability of PM Cares? I don't think there is a way to be able to do this, to be fully frank with you. Yukta has another question. What is your take on government having access to the public's online data? Isn't that a violation of privacy and freedom? Okay, so this is a great question. I'm assuming you're referring to the Arogya Setu contract tracing app. It's a tricky question. There are 3-4 different parts to this, right? One is, well, if the idea was that here is an app that allows you to trace, gives you a full picture of any disease movement, then Arogya Setu will fail. Why will it fail? There are only 300 million smartphones in India. Yes, so just by the math of it, it fails. Second is, if you think about this question of government and what, the big brother watching. If we had a privacy law, or if we had a constitution, Venkatesh, you referred to this earlier on in Swatantrata's principles, that the state a constitution which curbs the powers of the state. This is absent in India in many different ways, right? The constitution vests way too many powers with the state. It doesn't think of this needing to curb and control the state. It thinks of curbing the individual more often than not. The Supreme Court, which should be the vanguard of this kind of action, is usually too deferent to the government. Where it can increase the powers of the state, the court is always sort of happy and excited to do it. And therefore, we don't have the kinds of checks and balances on state's power. And therefore, it becomes doubly dangerous. Is it a violation in and of itself of people's privacy and freedom? I don't think so, right? Because you can choose to not go onto the app. That being said, because we don't have a law that says what government can and not do with publicly procured data, we have no control with what the government actually does with the Arogya, right? So it is dangerous, and it is something that we should all be very, very nervous about, despite the good intention that may have spurned the action. Next question is from Ram. Ram says, hey, why don't we ask people to ask their questions directly?
Okay.
Yeah, Ram? Ram Ambati?
Yeah, hi. No, I was just wondering. For the last couple of decades, investment has gone into tertiary care, largely in the cities, and the focus on primary care and preventive healthcare has been missing.
Sure.
Yeah, do you foresee down the road this epidemic will bring in a change? Do you think we'll start focusing so much more on preventive healthcare?
One can only hope. I am not a soothsayer, so I certainly can't say what will happen or may happen. What I can say is this is what should happen. Particularly, when we talk about the public goods role of the government and public health versus healthcare, I think this focus on prevention, focus on monitoring and data is such an incredible part of the government's role. As far as the private sector goes, my sense is that private sector will do what the incentives align for it to do. And if you want to increase the focus on prevention, then you want to also get out of the way of something. So for example, telemedicine. For example, use of private data setups, e-pharmacies. All of these come together in some weird way to start to allow for predictive tools to come about, to start, to start allowing new types of initiatives that focus on prevention, that focus on prediction, that focus on vector monitoring, right? And if that happens, I would be very, very excited about it.
Okay.
I think Usha, Amulya. Usha, Amulya, would you like to raise your question? Okay, maybe not. Let's move on then. Venkatesh Kon has a question.
Yeah, my question is like that.
Would you speak up, please, Venkatesh?
Hello?
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, your problem with mic. Actually, my question is why the state governments and district governments they don't have own strategic plan, so they are depending on central strategic plan only.
Absolutely, right.
So what is the problem with that? Is that process or something like that? Inavailability.
No, it's the Epidemic Act, as well as all of the funding for healthcare comes from the center. A lot of the regulatory setup is from the center. So we don't really have, thus far it's always been so centralized that states and districts have not even realized that they could potentially have their own strategies, right? One very simple thing is even state government, I think, is much too central. A state in India is a fairly large locus. If you think about cities, a huge mistake that we have made in our design of government is that city governments and particularly the political leaders in city governments have zero power, right? Yeah. So the mayor is not elected it's not the same the way a prime minister, the kind of responsibility or the kind of accountability we expect from a prime minister, the kinds of powers we have assigned to the prime minister or even to the chief minister, we have not done so at the city government level, right? So even if you were to have directly elected mayors, or at least mayors who are CEOs of a city government, then you can see that people would be able to demand accountability very close to home. And therefore, you would be forced to adopt decentralized strategies. So my sense is that this has not served us well in this kind of a situation. But it's also not profitable, right? So if Mumbai were to become a powerful city-state all by itself, even within the constitutional realm, it wouldn't serve the politics of the state as well as the center very well. And this is true of all of the cities of India. So we have, by not allowing for political power in the cities, we have truly shot ourselves in the foot for the long term.
Okay, next question, Jatin.
Okay. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so I think a very nice presentation. So I have a simple question. I think, COVID is very different in terms of the way it has grappled the whole world in a single stroke. So I just wanted to understand during, because you guys keep on reviewing a lot of literature. So have you come across, any country where you can, at this point of time, you can kind of conclude or maybe slight inferences where, uh, the policies, the healthcare policies of a government in any country and the
Yeah,
correlation to the, response to COVID.
sure.
So when we talk about emerging countries and in Southeast Asia, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and African countries where state is a kind of a sort of paternalistic state. But
Sure.
okay, but when we look at the developed part of the world, and the I mean, to my mind, I don't want to give my perspective at this point of time, but just want to learn from you guys uh, the correlation between healthcare policies of a country and their response to COVID, and
Sure.
vis-a-vis other countries. So your comments on this. Thank you.
Sure. That's a tough question, Jatin, because if you think about it, it's too short to set these kinds of correlations up. That being said, there are a few features of countries that have done well in dealing with COVID or in responding to COVID. A lot of people speak about, sort of South Korea, Singapore, and Sweden. I don't hold those up to be, sort of doing remarkably because we've seen ebbs and dips. The one country, though, I do think that has done a consistent and beautiful job of managing and both being prompt, being responsive, being communicative, being ahead of the curve in their planning. The one country I think that has done a bang up job is Germany. And Germany has done a few things differently and a few things right. One, like I said, it got rich, so that's a smart thing to do. It meant that they had far greater control on many other things. Second is that the German healthcare market is one of the is the prime example of light but tight. In that, the regulation is very, very strong. So you cannot mess around with a regulation. But regulations are not unreasonably heavy in their compliance demands. They're scientifically oriented, they're protocol oriented, but not risk averse. So, for example, if you wanted to get a new drug through in Germany, the kind of regime that you have around it, or you wanted to set up a new hospital. So it's a lot more friendly to private initiative in the area of health. So that's the second thing that I think they got right. The third is, of course, in responding to the pandemic. Immediately, the first thing that Germany did was to allow private sector testing and to set up ways in which the government would fund for people to get tested for COVID, right? So I find that to be quite remarkable that they were able to go on day one, right? So you had your procurement systems that were set up and operating beautifully. You have your fiscal accountability systems that are set up. You have, of course, the regulatory framework that's already there. So many of these things that we were not able to take advantage of here, they were able to take advantage. And my sense again is they are probably going to be able to reduce the hit of the pandemic far more than many other countries, both because Germany also has simultaneously set up sort of economic resilience for itself, right? It is one of the freest markets in the world. It is one of the most sort of governments that is very oriented towards the public good story, towards the minimum state but maximum governance type story. So my sense is that at least from what I have seen in testing numbers as well as scale and depth of the hit, I think Germany has done a phenomenal job. The jury is still out on what is going to happen with Sweden. It is still out on what is happening in Singapore as well as in South Korea. Though my sense is that what is common at least about some of the East Asian successes is their governments are also very strong arm governments and they're also very tiny countries. So what works for them doesn't naturally work for us. So these are some of my sort of bigger observations around what is happening in global patterns around health. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Hi, Vikas. Can you go for the question? Next one. Vikas, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I observed that things are getting too centralized during this lockdown.
Right.
Yeah, except for states like Kerala. So everywhere we see altogether centralization happening.
Sure.
But when things are approached in a decentralized manner, I feel it will be a lot easier to handle.
I couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. And I think that realization is hitting now. So from what I understand, most states, some have even done it at the city level, have started to set up de-lockdown committees. And these are set up with very smart people who have thought about these questions a lot. And their whole task is for a particular small geography, how do we get back to life per normal? So I couldn't agree with you more that decentralization is probably the right way, not just in terms of pandemic dealing, but also in terms of relief, rehabilitation, sort of emergency response, all of those things. We're probably best placed to tackle it when we decentralize. At least
Yeah,
this is
there's
my
another question. Yeah, the current situation is more than a speed breaker to the economy, right?
yes.
So it's almost like coming to a halt right now. So how do we take it forward? And they say that a crisis is an opportunity to relook at our things, the path, and make some changes which generally we couldn't make it, right?
Right.
So what do you think our role would be as civil society and
Wow.
those who are into public policy like that? What is the
Great
directional
question.
change that we should look forward to?
Great question. I think several different things, right? One is specifically on public investment. What do we
Okay.
spend government money on? Meaning taxpayer money on. Government money is the wrong term. What do
Yeah.
we spend taxpayer money on? Right? So just
Yeah.
rethinking the way we do our budget, rethinking the apportioning of money towards different asks from the government. I think this is problem number one that we need to quickly solve, or at least quickly create some momentum around cleaning up. This is submission one. Submission two is that for a long time, since 1991, in some way we have stopped thinking about prosperity. We have stopped thinking about the path to prosperity from private enterprise, right? Via private enterprise. How do we make life a little bit easier for all firms, be it informal firms, one single person firms, be it large agglomerations? So I think that's second. And there are some indications or opportunities, particularly with the uncertainty around China's role. There may be some opportunity for us to step in and do some of the manufacturing things right. So I think that's a second thing for us to get to start getting right quickly. The third thing is, to my mind, exactly what we just discussed, right? Decentralization, meaning
Yeah.
cities Swaraj. How do we get cities, people in cities to have accountability from their municipal corporations? How do we get elected leaders in these cities to be the CEOs of these cities rather than bureaucrats appointed by the state government? I think that's really, really important. And related to that is also how we classify a city, right? Today, it's profitable for most places in India to remain villages because more money flows to villages and there is somehow a little bit more power in Panchayati Raj institutions than there is in urban local body institutions. So I think that's really critical. So these are three big things that I would say. And there are many, many different line items within this, right?
Yeah. And one more thing is that any emergency
Sorry,
generally
could we
have
quickly
this.
give someone else a chance, please?
Yeah.
Is
Thank you
that
so much.
okay? And we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Thank you
Um,
so much.
I think Usha has been working, wanting to ask this for a while. She says, I would love to know your view on the question of patent pooling. What is your take on patent pooling? Patent pooling, is it a viable, given the necessity of vaccine development? Would public-private partnership work, or is it anti-competitive and dissuades innovation in the long term? Usha, unfortunately, I am not an expert on patents and intellectual property rights. So I want to excuse myself from trying to answer that question. I think there are some very smart people who are writing about the subject, and I would encourage you to read them rather than to ask me. So I know you've been waiting to ask this question for a while, and I apologize for disappointing you. There's a question from Priya Lakshmi. Priya Lakshmi, do you want to go?
Yes, ma'am. My question was, how does the role of traditional and conventional medicine, play a role in such in such a pandemic situation, given that we are using a hydrochloroxyquine for the as prescribed by the ICMR.
No,
So,
it's not.
what is?
Hello?
Hello, yeah. Am I audible?
Now you are.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to know what is the role of traditional and conservative medicine going to play a role in a pandemic situation like this, because HCQS was prescribed and certain traditional antibiotics which are used to treat respiratory diseases
Sure.
were prescribed. So how are we going to work on the traditional medicine, the Siddha, Ayurveda, homeopathy and Unani, and if the government is investing, what kind of impact it could bring, the research and development in traditional medicine could be, bring and be of use to us in such situations in the future.
I understand. Priya Lakshmi, though I want to make the question a little bit sharper, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
I think we should distinguish between modern medicine and traditional medicine. So when you say hydrochloroquine or any of those kinds of drugs, or for that matter, antibiotics, they are modern medicine, not traditional medicine.
Yes.
Right. So we're talking about traditional medicine. Yes?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I tend to be a little bit diffident about saying that this is the right answer or that these are the prospects. I want to instead use an example of the kinds of things that we may want to think about. The example is from TB, how we have dealt with TB or how we've been trying to deal with TB. So over the last many years, since almost the 1960s, 70s, India has run a TB program, right? Of different kinds of TB strains, of different, and it has really struggled to get TB under control. That being said, in the last decade or so, we've made some very interesting strides on controlling TB. So the first thing that ended up happening was that those who exhibited symptoms of TB would go to traditional medicine practitioners or even their local pharmacies and say, I have a cough, I'm struggling to breathe, will you prescribe something? And there was a lot of over-the-counter prescription. What ended up happening, or false prescription. What ended up happening because of this was that you started to see the spread of the multi-resistant strain of TB, MDR, which is really what, which means that it's much harder to control and much harder to treat, right? This was a disaster that was happening. So what did government do? Government, along with a number of different philanthropists and public health experts, started to think about this question. And they said, look, if people are going to the pharmacy and are going to their local, traditional medicine practitioner first, why don't we co-opt them? Why don't we bring, at the time they had started to set up the Ayush and things like that, why don't we bring Ayush practitioners, do a quick training with them, set up incentives for the right kind of treatment and referral, and bring all of these guys into the system. So it was a very nice way of using behavior change understanding or nudge understanding together with modern medicine understanding. So nobody was arguing that we could cure TB using traditional medicine, but the sense was that you could certainly improve bringing people into the net of both discovery as well as treatment if you co-opted traditional practitioners. So are you understanding? So that for me has been a very powerful example of how you can work with traditional medicine in order to, to deal with these kinds of problems in the future. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is on the prevention side. One part of prevention is the vector and, sort of spotting the disease and understanding the causes of it. But the other is also this underappreciated part around nutrition, around, sort of traditional additives to food that have a remarkable impact. I think the government is now making an enormous amount of investment in getting a lot of these traditional practices in the modern scientific lens, meaning that can we do randomized control trials to see the impact of turmeric or curcumin on health, on infection prevention or infection reduction. So those kinds of things they have a remarkable benefit. And this is why I think that government funding to the right kind of, to all kinds of science can be very beneficial. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
Great. Okay. Any other questions that we have missed?
We have one more from Usha.
I think it's the same question, no, on patent pooling.
No, she actually asked another.
Right, there's another one. Okay, Usha, since your mic isn't working, what should be the best policy practices to be adopted by civil society and individuals to keep a check on the surge in domestic violence? Well, that's really interesting. Again, I am not, I have not studied this space, but I, as a human being, I can think about some ideas, and a few of them are, see something, say something, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this phrase, but this started off in the world of policing, and it started off in the world of terrorism prevention, right? So you'll see in a lot of places your local police will have these blasts saying, if you see something, please report it, right? So I think that's one way to keep your eyes open. And this is by no means to say that you should report every incident, and because there are complex dynamics at play, and I don't know what the repercussions on human beings tend to be. But if you do see something, say something is a powerful idea to my mind. The second thing is also to be able to find ways of giving mental health counseling. A lot of organizations have started to bring in mental health practitioners to counsel their teams, to be able to talk to people, to guide them through this lonely and alienated time, to be able to provide a safe space for conversation. So these are things that I know that private enterprises and private organizations have taken on. And I think for our own organizations, these are sound practices. There are a few practitioners that I know that have been helping with organizations. And if you are interested in this, I'm happy to make a connection if that can help.
Okay. Thank you, Bhuvana. There is one more question Mohit wants to ask. Mohit, you can go ahead. Mohit, are you there?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So, we are going to observe a large fall in the purchase power or demand in the market in future course of action. So even if we start our firms, so they will not be able to employ the large amount of their labor to retake them. So what is possible course of action to cope up with this kind of?
Sure. I think last week I did another talk on this, and I can see the point of it. I'm not as pessimistic. I think firms tend to respond faster and at bigger scale than we anticipate. But sure, there is a large income shock, particularly on the poorest. And what can we do to make their lives or smoothen their income flows a little bit? I think there is merit in thinking through options. And one option that seems to me to be powerful is the option of unconditional cash transfers. I've had the chance to work on this a little bit over the last few years in different spheres with different governments. And these are remarkably powerful ways, one in alleviating sort of immediate cash flow needs, and two, in being able to allow for demand spurting and things like that. So I think that cash transfers are something that we should be considering very strongly and very quickly. I know that government is already doing this for certain particular sectors. My sense is, instead of trying to be targeted, we should be either universal or pick the largest targeting scheme that we have. In my mind, the largest targeting scheme that we have at the moment is the National Food Security Database. that allows us to do more broad-based targeting. And of course, if you wanted to do something universal, you've got the Aadhaar setup that allows you to do it. Of course, this is not to say that every single person who needs it will get it, because there are problems of inclusion and exclusion. That being said, I think in this time, it is hard for us to fix things that we have not fixed before, right? All we can do is sort of improve some of the accountability systems. Now, designing such an unconditional cash transfer program is really hard work. Some of this work has been done before because of the Jandhan Aadhaar mobile linkages, but it is not without its flaws. A lot of the times we have found in previous cash transfer programs that money was sent from the government, but people reported that they had no idea of the money key, right? So it was going into some bank account. The bank account was linked to this particular person's Aadhaar, but we don't know what happened in the intent. So fixing these systems are important, but also in crisis, it is very hard to correct systems. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other is to go back to this decentralization. The 15th Finance Commission has been deliberating and thinking about ways to devolve financing. This is something that they can think about even more seriously. They already agreed to sending money directly to cities and to Panchayati Raj institutions. Now we have to see if they can increase the amount of funds that are available and the ways in which these governments can choose to disperse it to all of these people. So I think there is some merit in thinking about this. In general, though, I'm not enthusiastic about the idea of universal basic income, but I think as a temporary stopgap measure, it's worth thinking about. But there is nothing so permanent as a temporary government scheme. This always worries me. I'm nervous about assigning such kinds of roles to the government because I know that they will never really cede it. So that's sort of my long and short on how can we help with some of these transition issues.
Okay. Bhuvana, I have one more question from Manasa. How can the government utilize this opportunity to record the database of migrant labor,
right,
considering they don't compose voting population in general? How to incentivize the government to ensure their social security in the future?
Sure. That's a tough question. I don't quite know. I'm torn about this question because on the one hand, having a list of migrants can help disperse aid. On the other hand, having a list of migrants makes it very easy for a government to harass and to extort because of the whole narrative of you're an outsider. I don't know if I want to assign that kind of power. As far as sort of social security goes, do remember that you do have social security where you are registered, right? So whether it is in terms of ration and PDS, whether it's in terms of a number of other government schemes, and my sense is if you are a migrant, by and large, you have a family somewhere, and that somebody is able to get benefits from this. Now the question is, what is fungible? In-kind benefits are not fungible. Cash, on the other hand, is. So if you were to be able to convert many of the existing schemes into cash, it would take care of some of these migrant social security concerns that even when they are away from their home, they have the ability to access that money. That's one way to think about the problem. I think Vikas has another question. Vikas?
Yeah, generally, this is no less than emergency, right?
I don't agree.
And generally, in these situations, the tendency is to shift authoritarian type.
Yeah.
Generally, the space for democracy will be shrinking during these times.
Yes.
So, as civil society organizations, how do we protect that shrinking of democratic space? Why? Because that critical dialogue and discussions during these times generally are not encouraged.
Sure. That,
what is your take on that?
That's a tough question to answer, right? Because it requires sort of crystal ball gazing. I don't quite know whether we will go down that path or not. That being said, I think what we should be reflecting on is, let's look around the world. By and large, those places that have institutionalized and made their democracy strong, not just their democracy, a republic strong, they tend to survive these kinds of blips, right? So do we, for example, even for a minute worry that Germany will lapse back into authoritarianism, or even the United States will lapse back into authoritarianism? The answer is not quite. We worry about places like India, which as it is, we are constantly on shaky ground, right? So my sense is that this is the long game. So we don't play for the next epidemic, we play for the next 70 years. So we've got to do everything that we can do to get institutions right, so that the next time there is a situation like this, there won't be centralization, or that there'll be options out of centralization. I realize that I'm not giving you a very clear answer to your question. And that's because this is something that's on my mind, and I'm not entirely clear that there is a silver bullet. The one silver bullet, though, is the creation of political power at the city and urban local body level. I think this is really, really important. Dispersing power allows the central government to become less relevant, also the state government to become less relevant, and over the long term, this is a good idea for us. As far as the space to dissent and criticize goes, I don't know. A mature government should take all opportunity for criticism and say, we will learn from this and get better and be more accountable and transparent. But where institutions don't already allow for this, it's a disaster. So for example, it's very hard for us today in India, to forget the government, to even criticize Supreme Court's orders, right? Because we can be held for contempt of court. This is absurd. We should get rid of these kinds of powers. So there is, sort of these things worry me. I think our poor institutional design. There is no point blaming a person or a political party or a government at this point in time. All governments, when they get the opportunity, will do this, right? Not just governments, but anytime you give excessive power, an institution will take it and play with it. So how do we limit those? That's the question on my mind. I don't have a great, sort of policy prescription on this. I think one thing that we should be thinking about is the anti-defection law. That's one way of making, sort of politics a little bit more real and salient. Can we do that in this time? Of course not.
Puna, we have a last question.
Sure.
Second. So intervention by the Supreme Court dictating the conduct of the test for the free and rollback was ill-advised.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman states there is no such a thing as a free lunch, as well as all entities work on incentives. So how can different institutions work to ensure such a testing in time, these kind of testing time?
So let me, I don't know if I fully understand. Is your question narrowly about testing?
I think it's the question about how can different institutions work to ensure we don't have such a free lunches during these kind of times.
Free lunches, right, yeah. Right. So I think some free lunches are better than other free lunches. What do I mean? I mean, if I'm giving a free lunch packet via the government, I think it's a bad idea. But if I'm not messing with prices and I'm giving you, say, a voucher, for example, to either buy the food or to buy yourself a test that the private sector prices as it prices everything else, I think that is less evil than, say, free testing or free food or free midday meals or etc., right? Which is why I think that how can different institutions work together? I don't think different institutions can work together. What you want is for different institutions to do what they are good at, right? So you want the private sector to be doing prices. You want the private sector to be doing demand supply matching. This is what the private sector does. Let them do it. So don't mess with the procurement of testing. Don't monopolize the supply of healthcare. Don't monopolize when the vaccine becomes available. Don't monopolize supply of the vaccine. Don't monopolize the drugs when they come out. It's not so much about everybody working together, but it's about each person doing what they're best at. In one thing that government can be really, really good at is creating the enabling environment, right? For the private sector to do this demand supply matching. What does the government need to do for this? A few things. One is to get its procurement policy right. Two is to figure out how it will allow for the poorest who will need it. And remember, the poorest need it, that is one part of it, but other people get infected. So it is also necessary to protect the other people. So how do we solve the externalities? There is a role for government. If the government can figure out a mechanism to give vouchers for testing, I think that's a great idea. The third is, like I said, the second is procurement. The third is decentralization, of course, allowing for local institutions to be able to deliver aid and relief and to be able to manage their spread and their vector control themselves. So I think I'm not a big proponent of the different institutions working together. There is a reason where we have a doctrine of separation of powers. Institutions are not supposed to work. In fact, a little bit of a healthy tension between them is a good thing. Venkatesh, I think there's one more question. Do we have time for it, or should we move
Go ahead,
on?
no problem. No problem. Last
I think this is from the other Venkatesh. Venkatesh, do you want to say your question out?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Actually,
We can't hear you.
sorry. One is like if the people are not ready to share their information, how the policymakers will generate new policies? That is one question. One more thing is decentralization. If peoples are not capable to have the power, so it gives an adverse effect also. Like in earlier governments, the corruptions and education of the peoples who are ruling. So these are the factors to give the powers also. So do you
Sure.
understand my question? Yeah.
So you have two questions. One is, if people are not sharing data, how will the government do things like cash transfers, correct?
Yeah. Like if
Okay,
some people
so
are
fine.
arguing about Arogya Setu is also tracking system or something like that.
Sure, sure.
Against privacy.
Sure. So that's one. Let me tackle that first, right? Now, the issue is not that people are not willing to share the data. The issue is people are worried about how the data will be used, right? So that's the problem to solve. If people are worried about that issue, how can we alleviate that concern? And the way to alleviate that concern is to put constraints on what the government can and not do with the data that is being shared with them, right? How do we do this? This is really tricky. It's not easy to write a privacy law. It's not easy to come up with a privacy management and monitoring framework, right? So who will watch the government? Who will monitor? Who will control? Who will check? What kind of checks will you put on the state? So that's the problem that we need to solve, not so much the worry about the policymakers. If policymakers really care about people, if they really want to make lives better for people and they think data is the way to do it, let them sign on to a privacy law first. So I think that's important. As far as your second question goes, on decentralization, so what happens if unworthy people, sort of come up? This is true at the state level. This is true at the central level as well, right?
Yeah.
So why is it any different for decentralization? In fact, the advantage of decentralization is that you're much closer to me. If you are my mayor and I am able to, between you and me is just 1 lakh people versus between you and me is 1.3 billion people, there is an account, there's a system that naturally lends itself to receiving and acting upon public feedback. Therefore, the dangers of what you were saying, say for example, corrupt tendencies, the worst of society, ill-educated, illiterate people coming and possessing power, it won't matter as much because there is a feedback loop, right? And that feedback loop does not exist when you are very far away from the power. So that's my sort of way of looking at it. So I don't think the dangers go away when they get centralized, right? But when they get decentralized, you get these opportunities to correct. Venkatesh, I think we're all out of questions now, finally.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask you one more question. It's not
Sure.
about the topic, but most of the participants are largely involved with civil societies and
Okay.
the local policy areas. They work with politicians, and also sometimes they work with
Sure.
youth organizations. And these days, actually, interest change towards policy making.
Sure.
So, what kind of opportunities CCS can actually have these days for young people who's actually interested in policy making,
Sure.
research, or in terms of fundraising or program making, and any other kind of opportunity? What kind of opportunities CCS can actually provide for these people?
Oh, great question. So a couple of different things, right? One is that, of course, CCS is not a funding organization, so it's unable to provide funds for action. What it can do, however, is if there are areas, CCS has a long history, it has an incredible network. So if there are connections to be made and facilitations that we can do, we're always happy to do that. So that's one, sort of help for grassroots organizations. To give you an example, in Andhra Pradesh, I know a number of you are based out of Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, they have a pretty strong network of friends and people who are linked into the political/public policy universe. For particular questions, we are more than happy to make these connections happen. This is true of many different places in India. So if it is situation specific, we can check and see who do we know, which parliamentarian do we know, what person in local government or in state government, what relationship can we make. So that's one thing that we're more than happy to do. Second is in terms of training. And Anas can back me up on this. CCS has, of course, done a number of different policies, policy training programs. I think Arpit has just written something about it. Our flagship program is the 2 to 3 to 4, sometimes, day iPolicy program, which is usually an in-person program, policy training program we do. These days, we have switched to digital delivery of the same program. It's now called e-policy. In fact, just this afternoon, I took a lecture at e-policy. So Anas can let you know when the next application round for e-policy. So please sign up. We also do these programs in partnership with institutions. So if, for example, you're at a civil society organization and you want to run one such program for your organization, we're always happy to tailor, customize, and deliver. We do that with universities, we do that with political parties, we do that with with other think tanks, we do it with particular industry bodies or firms, and with civil society groups. So please let us know, and we're happy to run these programs for you. So that's a second resource. The third resource is CCS also incubated the Indian School for Public Policy, ISPP. It is based in Delhi. And in fact, the second round, I don't know if applications are still open, but ispp.org.in. Please check it out, because ISPP runs a one-year program, a public policy program, and it's very, very highly rated. The first cohort is just going to graduate, and applications, if I'm not mistaken, are open for the second cohort. So please do check out ISPP. So that's a third big opportunity that I can think about. In terms of research and working with CCS or working at CCS, we're always looking for talented people to support us in research. Our research is data driven. Our research is, we try to be sort of very, very particular in investigation, in understanding the root cause. So we love engaging with folks who have grassroots knowledge and experience. And you're always welcome to apply to any of the open positions at ccs.in. And I'm always looking for exciting new people to collaborate with. Oh, lastly, for students among us, CCS also runs a summer internship program called Researching Reality. Again, in the past, it has been a field research program run out of Delhi. This year, however, we are moving it to a digital format. and the applications. We're accepting applications currently. Anas, is that right? Anas?
Anas is not available right now.
Okay, no problem, no problem. So you can reach out again via Venkatesh to Anas, and he can connect you to the team that's running Researching Reality this year. And come work with us anytime.
Yeah. And I myself actually graduated of policy but it's long back. I think like 6-7 years back.
Yeah.
I think one of my first introduction to the public policy was actually gone through policy, and it was really interesting program, especially those who are not from economics and political science background, because I'm a tech graduate. I have no idea what is economics is. But this course is actually really helpful. And also we did run a couple of policies back in Hyderabad a few years back, I think 2016 or 17. The response from the participants, mostly tech guys, it was very positive. I definitely recommend you to check it out, the course, and definitely you will go through, dig deeper into the public policy space.
Great. Venkatesh, may I add one quick thing?
Sure.
That's okay. Many of you are interested in the response to COVID. I did a talk last weekend, and I think that's available on YouTube streaming, that specifically focused on vouchers for testing and on cash transfers. How do you design these programs? So please feel free to watch it, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I would be able to send an email. One of my team members will send with the details to contact CCS, and also some of the resources to explore resources on COVID-19, and also how you can actually build a career in public policy, and also various websites that can actually be resourceful to you guys to explore various current affairs, and in terms of how policy can actually deal with it. Thank you so much, and we will be having another one next week. We will announce day after tomorrow, and I hope we would like to see. We would love to have you, all of you, there and exploring together how we can actually fight the COVID-19. And thank you so much, Bhuvana, for coming, sharing your experiences, and providing a long support since many years. And we would like to have run some other programs in future in collaboration with CCS and also other CCS network.
Call me back to speak. I'd love to interact again.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening. See you. Thank you.
Everybody stay safe, stay negative.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.